Our next speaker is Elad Simon, who is the co-founder and the CEO of Kraft IO. In his professional career, Elad has led small and medium-sized business marketing activities of Google in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, while working closely with product, sales, and account management. And his presentation will focus on the secrets of effective influencing. Also, I would like to remind you of the fact that you should upvote questions if you want to have them asked in the Q&A session after each presentation. So Elad, the mic is yours.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, everything's good.
Fantastic. All right. So hi everybody, and thanks Julia for the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to join and speak. So let me just start by sharing my screen. I'm new to virtual conferencing. I've done a lot of conferencing, but kind of new to this. Can you see this?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, so let's get going. So again, Julia, thanks for the warm introduction. I'm gonna start by just saying hi to everybody. My name is Elad Simon. I'm the CEO of Kraft IO. Kraft is a product management platform, which I'm gonna do a semi-shameless intro to in 2 seconds, and then afterwards gonna go directly into my presentation. Julia is smiling, which means that I'm doing good. All right, so jumping right in. So just a little bit about Kraft, really just kind of a couple of slides about Kraft, and then we just to tell people what are we about. So basically, I think everybody on the call knows that product management is hard, whether it's managing the noise, taking product decisions, or aligning the organization. And what basically Kraft does is takes all these challenges from product management and builds a system of record, which helps product managers kind of collect and synthesize all that information, take decisions, and then rally everybody around the decision-making process. So that was my shameless in-conference promotion, and now I'm done with that. So let's talk about secrets of influencing. So let's talk about influencing. Oh, no, not these influencers. No, let's move on. This kind of influencing. Yes, so I think we all know that influencing is very, very hard. I mean, whether it's in a relationship or with your kids or at work, it's not easy to get people to do things that you want them to do, and they don't want to do. So the first question to ask is, why is this important for product managers? Well, this is kind of very self-explanatory. So who recently had to convince somebody in their company or in their team to change things or to do things differently? Well, I suspect everybody does. Right. So I think generally speaking, wherever you have a situation where you have people, opinions, and resources or lack of resources involved, influencing is always a must-have skill for everybody. And what I see in many cases, what you see in organizations, in many cases, you see people, product managers are part of those, basically trying to influence basically just by having data or just by like convincing their boss or their boss's boss even, and feel that that's enough. And actually, I mean, obviously that's very important, but that's not sufficient. Eventually, as product managers, you're supposed to do 2 things. You're supposed to basically take decisions, and then you have to influence people to convince them that your decisions are right. That's pretty much the PM's job. Or as smarter people said, I'm gonna let you read this for a second. Generally speaking, a big fan of Dilbert's, in case you're missing. There's a lot of product management Dilbert's, so please go and look for it. All right, so I'm hoping you're convinced that product management, that influencing is very important. Well, how do you do that? And that's kind of what I want to talk about. Unfortunately, it's quite hard because everybody that you're trying to convince looks very, very differently. So this is an illustration of people who look differently in case you were missing it. So that's kind of like your list of stakeholders. And I guess the first thing you should do, and that's kind of like where I'm going to take this, is to do a stakeholder mapping. And this is really the topic of the presentation today. I'm going to start with this, with kind of like saying the very basic. Mapping the stakeholder starts with just making a list of everybody you feel is relevant for your decision or for your project. Obviously, it's a list that changes over time, so you kind of need to revisit it or kind of like think through it. But I mean, as an examples of people that you have to think through, obviously, you know, your boss, senior executives in the company, your team, key contributors, co-workers, and the list goes on and on and on, right? So now, while this seemed for some people extremely simplistic and extremely kind of like maybe stating the obvious, it is actually something that if you ask yourselves, when you did like a major project or you had to convince, let's say, a big amount of people in your decision, it is not a process that people consciously do. And it's something that is really valuable to just do that at least once and try to think of the people that you're trying to influence. And I would even dare you to try to think in their shoes, right? So try to think of when you're trying to influence people, what are they thinking about? What's their motivation of doing or not doing the thing that you want them to do, right? So now obviously this kind of stuff, so the sticky notes approach is very, very complicated to hold in your head or even on a board. So our friends in the 2x2 matrix department have decided to invent a 2x2 matrix exactly for this, and even invented an acronym called SMM, which is not Super Mario Maker, and it's not social media marketing. It is the stakeholder mapping matrix. And the stakeholder mapping, I'm going to go through this in very, very broad brush, and then we're going to take an example and kind of like deep dive and understand how this actually works. So the stakeholder mapping matrix has basically two dimensions. One is the level of interest, which is you can see at the bottom, and then the level of power that you can see on the left. And if you think of a company, and I know in a lot of cases, this feels like a very, very kind of like a, you know, political type of environment, but the reality is that I would dare say that any company above, I don't know, 20, 30 people, you need to think in those lines of thought in order to influence people. So obviously interest is like how relevant is your project or your product or your product decision to the people that you're trying to influence. And then power, of course, is how powerful are they in the organization. And as you can see, like every good 2x2 matrix, the top right is the one that you need to be most careful about, the people who have high interest and high power. And those are the ones you need to manage closely. The ones that have high power but low interest, you need to keep satisfied. That means basically make sure that they're not becoming a problem for you in the project and they're kind of happy with you. The bottom right is, you know, keep informed. And I would say for the bottom right, it's more than that, because sometimes even people with low power can be like, you know, kind of like they can help you rally other people around. So I think that's very important to keep them around. And then of course, the bottom left is like kind of like monitor or not do much, right? So now in order to take this from theory to practice, I'm going to share some of my experiences from Google. This is a story that I have shared in a few presentations, but I think it's a very interesting one. So I'm going to take you a little bit back in time. So this is now going back to 2014. For those who don't know who that lady is, this is Margrethe Vestager, who used to be the European competition commissioner. I had more hair at the time and less beard. And Google was in deep trouble with the European Union, which was basically claiming that they're trying to use their competitive power to kind of crush the competition. I'm not going to go in this discussion, and maybe afterwards the Slack channel is going to go crazy or something, but I'm not going to go in this discussion to who's right, who's wrong. That's not the topic of the conversation. This is really just background. So basically, Google was trying to show regulators as well as everybody else that they're a positive influence on the European economy. And as part of that, there's a task force that I'm part of it and trying to kind of like work on that effort. And basically, what I was in charge of at the beginning, and this is something that is quite common in the Google approach to marketing is really the storytelling. It's true for a lot of other marketing departments, of course. The power of storytelling, right? So really kind of like telling the story of how Google helps businesses in Europe to progress and to succeed. And then I realized through this process that there was a really big opportunity here. And this is one thing that I really like about Google. Google takes these opportunities. And like there was a big opportunity to actually build a big project with a lot of impact and really make a big difference on how people are using digital in general. And I wanted to build this, and I wanted to build basically like a digital platform that helps people with digital skills and getting their digital skills up and running so that they can help build their business or build their career with the power of digital. And so I really wanted to do this, but there was no project like that, right? So I had to influence a lot of people to make that happen. And that's after kind of like thinking about it and talking to a lot of people, I started basically doing what I said at the beginning, which is basically mapping the stakeholders and trying to figure out who am I supposed to influence in order to convince people to do this thing. So I started, and I mean, there's a lot of names here. We don't have to go into all of them in details, but these are real people. So there's like, Sundar is here, and Lorraine is here, who's a Google CMO. And basically, there's a lot of people I needed to convince in order to get the project up and running. And as I mentioned, I started using the SMM. So no, not that one, this one. And basically mapped all the stakeholders on the stakeholder map and really tried to figure out who am I supposed to convince and who am I supposed to keep closely to myself and who am I supposed to, and basically build out of that a plan. Now, I'm not going to go into too much details. Some of it is too detailed, but I would argue that this is something that when you're working on a project, especially if it's something that is, or product that is something that is meaningful and you need to influence people, this is really a really powerful tool. I would also suggest that you add another layer or another dimension to this, which is the dimension of color. So I think beyond just mapping people on power and interest, so you can see here on the top right, yeah, I had green and red and yellow, which is like kind of like neutral. And the idea with that is that you can understand very visually who are you, where are you in a good place and where are you in a bad place, and who do you need to convince in order to take to kind of like to keep on track with the team. Basically, I mean, to cut a long story short, I mean, there was a lot of excitement in Europe around this program, but then in the US, there was a lot of kind of confusion about why do we need this, and basically what I had to do is to build kind of like a plan in order to show the relevant people, the people either in red or in the higher brackets in this matrix, that this could be a very beneficial thing, both, of course, for the people that we're building it for, but also for Google as a whole. And eventually, I built like out of the matrix came out an actual action plan of like managing stakeholders. Now to think about that. And I mean, the long story short is it kind of came to life. And which was very, very exciting from my perspective. And obviously something that I was very proud of. I mean, ignoring again the context of the competition, et cetera, it's something that helped me and then obviously the company build something that was quite powerful and helped a lot of people, learn digital skills and grow. So I was very pleased with that. And this is something that eventually were kind of like exported to the States. And so that was very, very cool also. That's pretty much everything I had to say for today. I'm going to just kind of like try to synthesize the key takeaways before I kind of open it up for questions. So first thing is stakeholder management is critical. It's a critical part of influencing, and it's at the heart of GSD. I'm not sure. Can I say get? Yeah. get S done. So you'll figure out this. I am, and I'm gonna dwell on this point for a second, just because I know a lot of people in the audience are quite allergic to this notion of influencing, and it's part of the job. And as I mentioned, whenever you have more than 30 or 40 people in a company, you are responsible for that. And I know a lot of people coming in product management, and we meet like hundreds of them every month, are very much into, finding the right plans and building the right things and like identifying the right problem for users. And that's all amazing. But eventually, if you can't get the organization to do what you want, it really doesn't matter, right? So if you're like the most brilliant product manager in the world, but you cannot influence people to actually buy into your ideas, that's like, it's all going to stay in the planning drawer. And that's why I think it's so critical, and especially when you're trying to do a relatively big change in the product, or like, introduce a new product, it is super critical for you to try to figure out the stakeholder management map. Obviously, the second one is use the matrix. I think it's a very powerful matrix. While it's very simplistic and it seems like all 2x2s kind of like stating the obvious, but I think we all use, for everybody who's been a PM, like value effort matrix is also quite simplistic, but it's very, very powerful. Eventually it visualizes for people. So I'm a big fan of 2x2s. It helps people really visualize things for themselves and organize the world. So, and then once you do that, then really kind of come up with a plan. So especially if you have reds on the higher parts of the matrix, you really need to think through how to influence them and how to figure out how to move people into the right space with you. Last but not one before last is, of course, it's a dynamic world. I mean, things change, your stakeholders change, especially in companies, like people move, people change, etc. So just keep on looking at it. And then last but not least, and it's kind of like stating what I said at the beginning, don't avoid it. It's like the easiest thing to do in the world, but if you avoid it, it will haunt you down the line. So it's part of what you're supposed to do as a PM, learn it, master it, and influence people successfully. That's it. That's all I had for today, Julia.
Great.
I'm going to stop sharing now so you can.
All right. Thank you, Elad. We have a couple of questions coming in. The first one is, do you have any books you would recommend or ones that have helped inform your thinking on this?
Not books, but there's a great, I'm going to share afterwards on the Slack channel. There's like a really good article about the stakeholder mapping matrix, which I can share. There's even like a tool there. Swear to God, not my tool, didn't build it, not trying to promote it, just a good tool, just in case. But it's, yeah, so I'll share that. There is a lot of articles about influencing in general. I honestly think that the key thing is bring it to consciousness. I think a lot of cases, a lot of people just walk into it, right? So it's really that, I think that's the really big challenge for people. They just assume because they work in a company, it's like the company will figure it out, right? So there's going to be a process, and there's going to be like an approval process, and it's going to be okay. The reality is that humans are, even when they get into the office, they're still humans, and they have their fears and concerns, and you need to think about how to influence them. So, but I'll share after this on Slack the article, which I found very useful about that. So that was one.
Sure, thanks. The next question, can I use the SMM to also manage an overly hand-on executive or project sponsor? If so, what approach would you take?
Can you repeat the question? I missed it.
Can I use the SMM to also manage an overly hand-on executive or project sponsor? If so, what approach would you take?
So what's an overly? And I'm not sure I understand what's the question. Like, what's the overly?
Okay, let me,
something didn't jazz in my mind. Maybe I'm missing it on my colloquial English. But
we can move on to the next question, if anything, and then come back to that one.
All right.
Okay. So what do you think about the power of storytelling when it comes to influencing stakeholders, and any good example of that you have experienced?
So look, I think we're like living in the era of storytelling, right? So I think that's really like, it's been celebrated to the level of, ad nauseum, some might say. But eventually, I'm going to sound very cynical, but I am, so I'm going to just live with it. We live in a somewhat of a post-truth world, right? So I mean, there's a lot of storytelling out there, and I think we all kind of know that. Storytelling is a must-have skill, I think, for everybody in a company today. And it's not about like how charismatic you are or how good are you in presentation skills. It's about actually taking a bunch of facts or inputs that you have and wrapping it in a way that is easily digestible for people. Like if you're sitting in front of your VP sales or a head of sales, there is a different way of telling the story than if you're sitting in front of VP customer success or versus if you're sitting in front of your CTO or your VP R&D. These are different humans. You want to use the cliches, use the cliches. You want to use the generalization, use them. But regardless, these are different humans, and they will need to hear a different wrapper in order to understand and in order to be convinced. So strongly, I mean, it's kind of like stating the obvious, like, do you want to be rich, beautiful, and famous? Yeah, sure, why not? Like, obviously, storytelling is something that you want to master. But I would say, more importantly, find the lens that when you go into a meeting, you have in your consciousness, I am meeting with this person. I know this about him, and I understand that this is what might be concerning for him in the context of what I'm talking to him about. So it's not necessarily the beauty of, like wrapping it all up in a very beautiful presentation and making it all very shiny and smooth. In my mind, it's just tailoring the angle and the lens when you talk to people.
All right, sure. And one question, how do you manage micromanagements? Short one.
How do I manage micromanagement?
Yeah, how do you manage or handle micromanagements?
So first of all, be a CEO. That's easy. So when you're a CEO, you can only micromanage people. Nobody micromanages you. So that's one advice. Maybe it's not applicable to everybody, but anyway, just joking. The second one, look, I'm going to say something that might state the obvious. If you're being micromanaged and you don't like it, which I think most humans don't, step away. Just micromanagement is not something that goes away. It is very hard to influence people that their tendency to be micromanagers. I think you can try by reflecting back to the person what you're feeling about it. But generally speaking, my experience with micromanagement has been something that is hard to change with people because they feel, you know what? Actually, I'm going to give one piece of advice. And I think it's true for a lot of managers. Managers sometimes need to feel part of the actual doing. And I think I've had that feeling also as you grow up the ranks at Google and then later at Taboola also, you feel very detached. You start being just in meetings and just being in reading your emails and just basically just doing high level stuff. What I would recommend doing in the case of micromanagement, now thinking about it, find one space and even talk to the person who's micromanaging you. Find one space where you feel that person is really passionate about and let him micromanage you. Just let him be super involved in it, but then tell him or her, leave me for the rest. I'm giving you this space so that you can also feel part of the making, but please let me do everything else on my own because I feel very disempowered. So really try to find the space for both things to happen.
All right, that sounds like a reasonable answer. Thank you. Someone is also asking, do you have any tips for handling squeaky wheels? So like folks that complain or folks who have low power, but also, but always are needing to ask questions.
Run fast. Avoid corridor combat. No, just kidding. So look, I think it's all a matter of prioritization, right? So if people are of, I would say, low power in the context of the matrix that we just described, you're going to need to prioritize them. my thinking, so I mean, prioritizing meaning that you might just dismiss it, or you might just give them a very short answer and just move on with your life. While it's maybe unpleasant sometimes, I think it's part of the learning how to prioritize your time. And I think the way I always think about whenever I do something that I feel is not very kind to other humans, you need to think about the alternatives. So if you're spending a lot of time with people that are just wasting your time, you're not spending time either doing your job or talking to your team or working on cool things. So you need to really think about your time management in that sense. You do have people that are nagging in a way, so kind of like, but they could actually be like problematic for your project. In that case, you need to manage it. So they might seem low power, but if people, this is like a little bit like the chessboard thing, right? So if people are influencers of influencers, they're also influencers, if that makes sense, right? So you need to kind of think in two levels. And sometimes if people are nagging, but they are also influencing people who are of power, you need to manage it. They're not low power. By definition, they become higher power because they're influencers of the people you're supposed to be managing.
All right. Okay, Elad, thank you. That was a great presentation. Thanks for everything. Also, you can join our Slack channel on Product Tribes to join the discussion. There's more questions. And guys, remember to ask questions. This is your chance to squeeze out information during the discussions and sessions. All right, so we will be taking a short break, and we will be right back.